Hey everyone, how's it going? Welcome back to our hands-on with Maxon Redshift workshop. I'm Ellie and I'm joined with my good friend Chad. Chad, how's it going?
Good, Ellie. What's up? How are you doing?
I'm good. What's with the sign? Like we
It's a
haven't
special day's
prepared
birthday
this.
today. It's the
It's
birthday of a special person. It's your birthday,
it's
Ellie.
my
Happy
birthday today,
birthday.
everyone. So, most
Woo!
important thing out of the way first.
Yes.
So we're half celebrating today because it's my birthday, and we're also celebrating because we get to do this hands-on with Maxon workshop with everyone.
Woo!
And also a big hey to everyone, hey to Hannah, hey to Eno, Stefan. Thanks for wishing me happy birthday, everyone as well. I mean, I'm shamelessly loving it. I'm not gonna lie, it's really great. But it's great to be here with you all, and to be with you, Chad, as well.
Thanks. It's good to be here.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, no, it's good to be here as well.
Lovely.
I'm looking forward to this one. And so I did actually see in the chat, someone did say, was there a session last Wednesday? No, don't worry, everyone. You haven't missed anything. We just had to postpone it by a week. So this is now technically part 2. So we just kind of pretend like last week didn't happen. So don't worry, you haven't missed it. It is happening today. And we'll put the recording on either later today or sometime tomorrow. So let's get into what we're going to be doing today, because we have so much great stuff to go through today that I don't want to spend loads of time doing like a big introduction. But I'm just going to I'll do a little mini one, get a little mini one out of the way, just in case anyone is new. If this is the first time you're on a hands-on session or a first time joining our Redshift workshop, we have some little extra bits for you guys. So let me just get to this and kick this off. So here are the new dates. So part 1, which we did 2 weeks ago, this is now on our Maxon Training Team YouTube channel. So if you haven't seen that before, then that's where we basically upload pretty much every single session that we do, whether it's demystifying, whether it's like hands-on, whether it's like Maxon Color, all of that cool stuff is on there. And we now have part 1 on there as well. Part 2, Node Materials. That is now today. So don't worry, not missed it. That's happening today. And then next week, so now the 23rd, we're going to be doing part 3, which is lights, camera, and post effects. And then week 4, or part 4, is now going to be happening March 2nd. So those are the new dates for you all. Let me go to the next one. So we have some extra bits. I'm not going to worry about going too much into these, but if you want to check out what you get if you're part of this workshop, then this is what you get. You get, sessions are recorded, you can have your trial extended. And sorry to any of the ones I haven't done yet. There are so many of you who have been emailing. I'm trying to get through them as quickly as I can, as are our kind of like support team. We're trying to extend those. But yeah, if it hasn't happened yet, either drop me another email at training@maxon.net and I'll try and get through those as quickly as I can. All of this information, as well as sort of like project files and everything, should be in the handout section. But if not, I'll just really quickly show you how you can find this. If you go onto our Maxon.net website, head over to news and then events, and then click on any of the hands-on with Maxon workshop parts. So any of these, just click on them, scroll all the way to the bottom, and then we have all of the links that you could need for that, including our project files. So in here, here's where you can find all the project files, including like a course guide and some additional assets and all that cool fun stuff. And you might, any eagle-eyed people might notice there is actually a new document here, this new one here. And so last time we ran this, so in part 1, there were so many amazing questions, so many that we didn't actually even have the time to answer them all. But I want you guys to know that we, like both me and Chad, we love answering your questions, and we love that you guys keep this super interactive. So we now have a Q&A document of all of your questions from part 1, and I'm going to continue to do it for parts 2, 3, and 4. So if you asked a question last time and it didn't get answered, check out the Q&A. Hopefully it's now been answered. If not, drop it in an email and I'll try and answer that as much as I can. So look at all the great questions you guys asked. So yeah, feel free to check that out on there if you want to. So this week, what are we going to be doing? We're looking at node materials. So we touched on this a little bit in the first part. We looked at, the shader graph and the material node, but we're going to be diving in even further And we're going to be looking at what I'm classing as the essential nodes inside of Redshift. So as you guys can imagine, there are lots of nodes for lots of different things. It would take me way over 2 hours to go through every single one. So instead, I thought I'd show you the ones that are going to give you a nice starting point to learn Redshift and to learn building your own materials from scratch. And they're also going to be the ones that you'll find are more commonly used and more used kind of like frequently. We're going to look at working with texture maps. This is going to be quite a big topic today. I know this was brought up in the first session. We had a couple of questions about this, as well as the Redshift object tag. And hopefully I'm going to save kind of like a few minutes at the end to talk about converting C4D textures to Redshift textures. So let's get into it. Let's get started. Let's just open up C4D. I've also got a little bit of a cold, so I apologize now if I start coughing. I'm going to try my hardest not to. So let me just come into here. I'm actually going to switch off my camera just so you guys can see my screen a lot better. And also, don't forget, ask all your questions. So we're so fortunate to have Chad here, and Chad's going to be like the voice of you guys. So he's going to be able to interact with me, chat with me, ask any questions that you guys have about any of the stuff that we're doing inside of Node materials. And I'm really glad you're here, Chad. I'm happy to see you.
Thanks, Elly. You give me too much credit, but thank you so much. I'm honored to be here.
Cool. So let me just move this out of the way, and we're just going to get straight into this because, you know, we've got some cool stuff to show today. So let me open up these files. So inside of the project files, there should be a folder called Rs Node Materials, and inside of that there should be an empty scene, and then also a final folder which has a final scene. So we can have a look in here, and we have our final one as well. So if we have a look at this folder, so this is it here, we have our final.c4d file, and we have a texture folder as well. And inside of this texture folder is going to be all the textures that I used for this particular scene here. And I just need to do a quick shout out to Ambient CG. So Ambient CG is the website that I actually used for all of these textures and these different texture maps for this particular project file. And the reason that I use Ambient CG, I mean, there's a couple of reasons, but the main one, if we go over to license, we can see, if we have a look at a quick summary here, we have what's called a Creative Commons license, which gives us the freedom to use these assets at our creations in situations that require them to be redistributed, i.e. this workshop, and also for commercial projects. And it says no requirement to give credit, but of course it's appreciated. So here's my credit. I love Ambient CG, and I think they're incredible, and their assets are amazing. And absolutely, that is why I used them on this project, but also so I could share them with you guys and have no issues. And so just really quickly, like, we won't worry about going into it too much, but this is the website. We have assets, materials, HDRIs, all that fun stuff. And if we just click one of these, we have up to 8K. Like, that's such like loads of people can go online and you can find cool like textures, but there'll be 1K or 2K. We have up to 8K like JPEG or PNG textures. And we even get to see the method in which they were created. So this one was created inside of Substance Designer. So we can download those textures, we can use them, and then that's how we're going to be building some of our textures today. And so I just thought I'd say, if you don't use Ambient CG already, you definitely will be after this session, trust me. And so those can be found in here, as well as a couple of different like texture maps, like dirt maps or finger scratches, and these are actually from inside of the asset browser. So we're going to be taking some of the textures from the asset browser today as well. Okay, so let's have a quick look. Let's have a quick look at this final project first. Let's see how this is looking. Cool, so let's come into our Redshift menu, and we're going to grab our Redshift render view. So remember, this is how we can see our interactive preview render, and we can see exactly how our lights and our textures are looking inside of our viewport. So I'm just going to dock this here. You guys don't need to do this. I just like to do it so you can see like everything that I'm doing. And I'll do the same when we create our materials as well. So let's just kick this off and let it sort of play for a sec. It's going to have a think about it first. So this is hopefully going to be the point we get to today, but I do love to give myself too much to do sometimes in these 2 hours, but we'll see what we do. We'll see how we get. So if we then go to the empty version and we sort of kick this off, we can see that we have some of the same stuff already. So for a start, we've got our Redshift camera in here. If you want to move this around, all you need to do is take the protection tag off of it. So at the moment, that's got a protection tag, so you can't move that around, but you know, you can still come out of that if you want to. And as you can see, I'm not the best modeler, but hey, it works. And we've got our lights set up already because I thought I wanted to spend this session creating our materials. I didn't want to worry about lighting or anything. We'll worry about that next week. So I've left the lights in there and we've left all of our geometry. And what we're going to do, we're basically just going to create our materials now from scratch. Because I was trying to think of what was like a cool and fun way of showing you the essential nodes inside of Redshift. And it's not going to be fun for anyone if I just sit here and go, this node does this or this node does that. So I thought, well, why not just build these textures, build these materials, and use as many of these essential nodes as I can, so you guys can practically see how they work and how this stuff gets put together. And so that's basically what we're going to do. We're basically just going to build some textures. So let's just get into it. Let's get into it. We've got a good hour and 45 minutes to get through as many of these textures as I can. And we'll start small. So what we're going to do, we're going to start off by creating the wooden planks that's on this sort of like back wall area here. And then we're eventually going to build up to creating that worn and torn leather material inside of here. So how do we start to create some textures and materials inside of Redshift? So first of all, we're going to want to open up our material manager. And inside of here, this is where we can start to create our materials. So we had a look at this in a little bit of detail in part 1. So we can come up to our create menu, and then we go over to Redshift because we need to make sure we're creating Redshift materials. And we're going to be creating some standard materials today. So these are all like the base textures that we can create, and they can be used for a variety of different reasons. For the purposes of today and the purposes of learning how to work with nodes, we're only going to be creating standard materials. But we're doing a demystifying session in March where we're going to be diving into a few of these other ones. So let's create our Redshift material. And so the first one we're going to do is going to be it's going to be like slatted wood. So let's just call this slatted wood, and I'm just going to do _RS. That is not anything you have to do. It's just something that I do when I work in Redshift. And to open this up, to open up our shader graph, which is where we're going to be working with our nodes, all we have to do is double click. And it's going to open up our Redshift shader graph. And let me just dock this as well, because I like it that you guys can see like everything that I'm doing all on one screen. And so I know it's a little bit tight, it's a little bit of a squeeze, but I think it's really great when we're all kind of learning Redshift together. So in week 1, we had quite a detailed look at the shader graph, and in particular, the Redshift material. So when we first create a material or a standard material in Redshift, we get our Redshift material node and we get our output. And our Redshift material is where we can find all of our different settings for like our diffuse, our reflections, our sheen, our refractions, all that cool stuff. We went into a lot of detail about this in part 1. And so I'm not going to go into that again. So if you do want to have a kind of like a recap, then definitely head over to the YouTube channel and just have a little flick through. Like I'm pretty sure like we have timestamps on them as well. So if we head over to like the intro to Redshift, we have our timestamps all in here. So if we just go to, where was it? Around here, RS node materials, output node, material node. And just sort of remind yourself of these different like settings in here, because this is quite an important step when we're looking at creating especially realistic looking materials. We do want to make sure our base properties are set up ready for that texture. For example, if we're creating a metal, we do want to make sure we have like GGX and a different Fresnel type. So those settings are definitely going to give us a nice kind of like starting point when working with our different like texture maps and our different nodes. Cool, so let's build this slatted wood. Let's see how we can do this. So we're going to actually create this first material by using a couple of different texture maps. And so these can be found in our texture folder. So we're actually going to be working with these wooden floor texture maps in here. So if we just open this up, we can see exactly how these are looking. And so what we can do, we can use these different things to control the different inputs of our Redshift material. You're probably thinking, what does that mean? Well, let's have a look. So when working with texture maps, it's very important that we use what's called a texture node. And the nicest thing about Redshift, or something that I find quite nice, is the names of the nodes that you need are pretty like artist or user friendly. So if I'm using like a texture or a texture map, I need a texture node. If I'm using a bump map, I need a bump node. And so this is where the search bar comes in handy. Like I definitely don't go searching through all of these to find the node that I need. All I do is just type in a bit of the name and it's going to give me the node that I need to use. And so because we're working with texture maps, let's grab our texture node and we're going to drag and drop it in. So that's how we bring a node into our shader graph. We just drag it in and I've got my left mouse click down and I let go and it's going to bring it into our shader graph in here for us. And I don't need two of those, I just need the one. And another quick reminder, whatever node you have selected is first of all going to be highlighted orange, much like it is inside of Cinema 4D. And we're also then going to get our attributes on the right-hand side, which is really nice. Cool. So if we look at our Redshift texture node, what do we have inside of here? So first of all, we have a basic tab, and this is where we can actually change the name of our texture. I'm trying my hardest not to cough right now. So inside of here, we can change our name. And then we can also, inside of our general tab, this is where we can start to make some of our adjustments. So first of all, we have our file path. So our file path is where we're going to be loading in our texture. We then have a color space, and then we then have the ability to change and control our UV and our remapping on our texture. So that's our texture node. However, there is a quick way of actually adding a texture node with our texture already in it. And if we come to our Finder, so these are the textures that I want to include. So instead of having to grab a texture node for each one and locate or load in the texture into our path, we can really easily grab them all and just drop them into our shader graph. And it's going to say, this image isn't a project search path. Would you like one? No, I don't want one. I don't need to do that. So I'm just going to press no. And let me just delete that. And so now what we can see is we have a texture node which has our texture map already loaded inside for us. So we don't have to worry about doing that each time. Let me just spread these out. So we can see all of those. Okay, cool. So what do we have here? Which texture nodes are we using? So we're using a color, a roughness, a normal, and a displacement. And so you might find you may have different ones, and you may have like metalness or reflectivity, or you could have like ambient occlusion, but we're just going to worry about these 4 for now. And these are going to still give us a nice base look. Cool, right, so inside of our Redshift material, so this is where we have access to all of our different like inputs. So for example, we have our diffuse color. And so we can come into our color and we can adjust that as much as we want to. So let's just drop that on our object, and we'll actually get our render view playing, and we'll sort of get a bit closer so we can see this. So we get our render view playing now, so we can see that. Hopefully you guys can still see that. Maybe I'll give myself a little bit more room. Okay, cool, we'll leave that like that. There we go. Okay, so yeah, we have these different inputs inside of here, which we can control based on these individual parameters. But what if we want to use different nodes to control these different inputs? And this is what we're going to be doing now. So inside of my Redshift material, if I click this blue little icon here, so let me just pause that for now, we don't really need that going. If I click this blue little icon, you will see we get this long list of drop-down options. And you're probably thinking, what are all these different options? Well, what they actually are, if we look at base properties / diffuse color, all they are the inputs of this Redshift shader node. So we can see we have base properties, we have diffuse, and we have diffuse color. And so that is what this input is. And what this means is we can now use a different set of nodes. So for us, it's going to be these texture nodes to control these particular inputs. And so let's actually just do that so we can see exactly what that means and exactly what that does. So the way that we connect these together is we're going to start off by doing the color first. So we're going to take our output color and I'm going to click and hold, and then we get this branch that comes out. So we can see, so I've got my left mouse click down. That's why my icon is red, because I've got red for left click, blue for right click. So I have that held down. And what you'll notice, if I hover it over my blue area, it goes green. So it goes from orange, it goes to green. And this is saying, okay, yep, you can input this texture or this particular node into an input inside the Redshift material. Cool, that's exactly what I want. I want it to be controlling my diffuse color. So I'm going to let this go, and then it's going to say, okay, which input do you want this now to control? And I know that I want it to be controlling my base properties, diffuse color. So all I need to do is click that, and if we just kick that off, we can now see, first of all, we can see in our viewport, which is kind of nice. And we can also see in our render view that we're now having this texture map, this color texture map, controlling our diffuse color of our Redshift material. And if we go inside of here, we can now see this is completely grayed out. So I can't even now change the color of this. And that's because it's being controlled by this node here. And so this is how we start to connect our nodes together. And in particular, it's how we start to connect our texture maps to our Redshift material. One important piece of information. So we're not really going to go into like color space or ACEs or any of that in detail. But if you're using a color texture map, which could also be called base color, albedo, diffuse, we do need to make sure our color space is corrected from auto. Oh, I can't see because this is in the way now. All the way down, if we go to File IO, we have sRGB, and this is the correct color space, and we get the correct color output now for our diffuse color. So that's just a little piece of information that you'll need to remember when you're working with a color texture map. Okay, so we've looked at how we can connect our first texture map to our Redshift material, and we've seen how exactly that works. Now let's go to our next texture map, which is our roughness texture. the difference with the roughness texture is, if we look at our diffuse color, we can see that we have like the color, like the color picker or the color selection. So we can kind of understand how this color texture map can be projected onto the surface of our material. However, our roughness, so if we come down to our reflection roughness, works with values of 0 to 1. It doesn't really work with like diffuse colors as such. And so how does this texture map get to the point where it's controlling the roughness values? And so the way that this works is, if I take my output color, I'm going to actually plug it straight into my surface. And this is a really nice, useful way of seeing, first of all, how it's projecting, and second of all, sort of like the different color channels of it, whether it's grayscale or whether it's kind of like a diffuse color. It's nice for us to see this just on the surface so we can get an idea of how this is going to work. And so the way that this roughness texture works, so we have a grayscale texture. What happens when we connect this to our roughness? Everything that is 100% white, so we see these little sort of areas in here, translates to a roughness value of 1. So we know a roughness value of 0 is 0% roughness. So we get a shiny texture or a glossy texture. A roughness value of 1 gives us a 100% rough or diffuse texture. And so on this roughness map, everything that is 100% white will give us a roughness value of 1, therefore will be very rough. And everything that is 100% black, we don't really have much, but we can see we have some darker areas in here. That will translate to a roughness value of 0. Therefore, it will be shiny and glossy. And then everything in between, so everything that is like gray or these mid-gray colors, would translate into a value between 0 and 1. So we're able to now use this roughness map and these grayscale colors to now control the roughness values between 0 and 1, creating some nice realistic looking textures.
Hey, Elly, I got a question on that.
Yeah, sure.
Can I interrupt? Whenever there's anything, any kind of like, displacement, anything where you map like grayscale values to a thing, I like 100% forget which color does what, like whether white does the thing or white makes it rough or black makes it rough. Is there like a quick way to like invert the colors of a map, or is there like a node that you use, or is that something you would cover later?
Yes, there is, and it is something we will cover later. There is definitely a node that we can use to invert that, and yeah, absolutely.
Okay, then just kidding.
We are definitely going to be covering that because we like more often than not we do find like I'll be using later on textures from the asset browser, and when I use them as a mask, the colors are often inverted or need to be inverted, and so absolutely, yeah, and there is a really quick way we can do that with one simple node. So we will be taking a look at that.
Sweet.
But yeah, it's kind of so white translates to a value of 1, black translates to a value of 0, and then everything in between is then a kind of a gradient of that. Cool, so let's actually now connect this into here. So we've got our color back in there, and as we can see, it's super shiny, super glossy. And if that's what you want, then cool. But for me, I'm actually going to use this roughness map to create a slightly more realistic looking texture. So what I'm going to do, again, I'm going to pull out my out color and I'm going to just highlight it over my blue area so we can see my little branch has gone green. So I can let that go. And I know I need to be looking inside my base properties, reflection, roughness. So it might take a little bit of time to kind of see where exactly the different inputs are. But if you want to, you can always type in the search. So we can type in, if I can spell, that would be great, like reflection, and it's going to give us that as well. But I know I can just drop this into my reflection roughness, and that's now updated, and we can now see we're having a much more like matte or diffuse looking texture. Okay, right, so what's next? So let's now take a look at this next one, because we have a bit to talk about when it comes to using a normal map. So I'm just going to click this, And so we can see that I'm using a normal map inside of here because it's got, you know, those sort of like purpley blue colors inside of here. Oh, one quick thing. See, even I forget to do these things. Our roughness map, our color space, it is also very important to change this. But this time we need to make sure our roughness is changed to raw. So see, even I forget to do that sometimes. So back to our normal map. So when we're working with bump maps or with normal maps, inside of standard materials, so inside of like the normal material editor, we have to enable the channel, right? That's what we have to do. If we're working with bump, we need to make sure we just click that little checkbox inside of here. Let me actually open it up. We have to check this little checkbox. This is us enabling our bump. Think of Redshift in a similar kind of way. We need to enable our bump inside of the Redshift shader graph. And so because we know we need to do that, we therefore need to grab a node for this. That's kind of like the way that I try and think about it. And the important thing to mention here is so if we just come into here, we do actually have a normal map node. However, this is a legacy node. It's an old node. Now, what Redshift have done is they've improved the bump map, and the bump map can now be used whether you're working with a bump map or a normal map. So you only need to use a bump node with whatever you're using, whether it's a bump or whether it's a normal. And so for me, because I'm using a normal, I'm just going to grab my bump map. And the way that this works, let me just kick that off. The way that this works.
Yeah. So just, I think I heard you correctly, but you use the bump map node, whether you're using a normal map or a bump map.
Yes,
is that right?
That's right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so we used to have a normal.
Knows?
Huh?
Because those are like different maps, right? It just kind of like knows the different.
Well, we do actually have some settings that we can change, which we're going to take a look at now, dependent on whether you are using a bump map or a normal map.
I should just stop interjecting. Okay, I'm gonna let you do your thing.
No, it's good. No, it's all good. Because other people might be thinking the same stuff, so it's definitely handy. So cool, we've got our normal map. And again, much like our roughness, we do actually need to change the color space to raw. So color, sRGB, roughness and normal, raw. Those are the things that we need to change when we're working with these. Okay, so right. So we don't need our normal map. We only use a bump map, whether we're using a normal texture or whether we're using a bump texture. And that's because inside of our bump map, let's have a little look at the settings inside of here. So first of all, we have a texture section and we have texture enabled. That's great, cool, because we're using a texture. And then we have this second option. This second option is the most important setting. Well, one of the most important settings. We have a drop down. We have height field, tangent space normal, and object space normal. When you're working with a bump map, you're working with a kind of a height map. And what that means is inside of our bump map node, we need to make sure our input map type is set to height field. So if you're using a bump map, so a grayscale bump map, you need to make sure that you're using an input map type of height field. However, and like in this case now, if you're using a normal map, we need to make sure that we change this to one of these normal settings. So object space normal, if you have a map that is, say for example, you've had a texture baked out in specifically for an object based on the object, like normals and things like that, you can use object space normal. However, if you don't, and like in our case, if we're just building this texture of texture maps to put on a random object, we need to make sure that we select tangent space normal. Basically, if you're unsure, use tangent space normal because it's going to look at the direction of the normals of the object, and therefore we're going to get the correct kind of mapping and the correct kind of directions for our normal map. So height field, bump map, tangent space normal, normal map. So let me just change that now. And so how do we connect these together? And so we need to make sure we have like a correct order of process. So we have our normal texture, and then we need to basically enable our bump. So we want to make sure our bump is between our texture. And then we want to put this onto our Redshift material, and then it's going to go on the surface of our object. So let's connect everything together. So again, we want to grab our output color. And to input it onto any node, we just want to make sure we highlight over this blue little icon. So if we let go of this, we have a remap option, but for our sakes, because we're working with textures, we just want our texture input. That's all we want to do. So we're going to select that. And then we need to output our bump map into our Redshift material. So it's going to go on the surface of our object. So I'm going to take my output and I'm going to put it over this little blue icon. And I know bump comes up under the overall option. So if you go all the way down to overall, or, you know, again, just type it in, you could type bump in, it's going to come up. And we're going to select bump input. And so now hopefully you guys can see that that is now, that normal map has now added some kind of surface detail onto here. And then this is where our height scale can be adjusted. So the same as like your height percentage inside of the standard material editor, we can control our height scale here, and we can go up or down dependent on, you know, the level of detail that you want. I tend to go with maybe like a 0.5 because I don't want any like crazy looking detail. If I want, I guess for me, like the general rule is if you want a little bit of detail, use bump or normal. If you want some like big heavy displacement detail, use displacement. But for the sake of this, we'll demonstrate both just so we can see how it works. So we're pretty much there. The last thing we're going to do is we're going to actually set up some displacement just so we can see exactly how this works, because displacement is actually slightly different in the way that we set it up inside of the shader graph, and we have to do a couple of extra steps to make it work basically. So again, much like our bump map, we needed to get a bump map node. Because we're working with displacement, luckily enough, everything's named in a really lovely way. We just need to grab our displacement node. And again, this is going to go between our texture and my next node. So looking at our displacement, we have our displacement scale, which is, you know, similar to our height scale in here. We have a map encoding, so we can use a height field or we can use a vector. And then we also have different kind of, you know, like object space or tangent space types as well inside of here. But I'm going to leave everything as default because that's going to work absolutely fine for me. And so what we can do, let me plug this inside of here. And again, you know, everything's named in a nice way. So because we're working with a texture, we can control and we can select texture map. Inside of here, if I type this for displacement, we can see that we don't actually have a displacement input inside of our Redshift material node. And that's because displacement isn't like a surface, it's not like surface detail, it's affecting our geometry instead because we're getting that displacement. And therefore what we need to do, we actually need to input it in this final node here. So if I click my blue area to get my inputs for that, you'll see that we get displacement in there. And so this is where things are a little bit different. We need to make sure that we plug it into our output because it can't go directly onto our Redshift material. So let me plug this straight into here. We can see our little branch has gone green. And I'm going to select displacement. And we're probably all thinking, Ellie, it doesn't look any different inside of here. And actually, I think what I needed to have done is I have not deleted that. Let me delete all these. So I actually needed to make sure those were off of there. Okay, cool. Right, so we'll start that again. We have no displacement. And that's because we need to do a final step when working with displacement inside of Redshift. And what we need to do, we need to tell Redshift that, okay, cool, this object now, or this kind of model, has displacement on it, and we need to enable that. And the way that we enable that is using tags. So if you've been working inside of Cinema 4D in the past, the chances are you've probably used Cinema 4D tags before, whether it's for rigging, whether it's for compositing, whether it's for, you know, dynamics. And we have some Redshift tags as well. So if we find our object that we need, so it's our wooden slats, I'm just going to right click, and here is where we can find all of our different tags for, you know, our variety of different things inside of Cinema 4D. And what you'll notice, once you've installed Redshift, you'll have access to Redshift tags. And we only have two. We have a camera tag and an object tag. Camera tag we'll be looking at next week. But for this, and for the purposes of displacement, we need our object tag. And so let me just grab that on there. And so we have our Redshift object tag inside of here. And we have, you know, a couple of different settings in here, but we're not really going to worry about many of them. Visibility is very handy if you're used to working with the, what's it called, the compositing tag inside of Cinema 4D. And, you know, we hide things from our cameras, or we hide things from our secondary rays. This is a similar sort of thing. We have a visibility tab where we can start to hide our objects from our primary, so our primary GI rays, or our secondary GI rays. We can adjust our shadows. We can have things, so, you know, sometimes you can see lights in reflections, and, you know, we all kind of really dislike that sometimes, don't we? Here is where you can hide those. And then we have like visible and stuff to GI. So this is a handy little tab for those kind of extra little bits inside of your render. But the thing we want to be looking at is this geometry tab. So I'm just going to override my geometry. And we have tessellation is our first option, so like our subdivisions. But we're not going to worry about that. I'm going to come all the way down to displacement. And by default, it is it's not enabled. So let me just enable my displacement. And so now, hopefully you can see, I'll come a little bit in here, you can see that we're getting some of this nice looking displacement inside of our render view. So these settings, so this displacement scale is the same as this displacement scale. So depending on how you want to mess with it, you can do it inside the tag or inside of the node. Let's come back down to here. So we can change our displacement scale. We could sort of like push this up to maybe something like 5, so we get a much more intense level of displacement. But the important thing here is displacement scale and maximum displacement kind of work like hand in hand. So because my max displacement is only set to 1, we're going to get some like clamping or clipping occurring. So even though I'm increasing my displacement scale, it might not actually be hitting that displacement scale because my max is so low. So if I now put my max on something like 5, you'll notice, hopefully you guys saw that. Let me put that back down to 1. If you check out the render view, we're now getting that sort of like that correct displacement scale because we've upped our maximum displacement. And I mean, I know this is way too much, like I'm going to be putting it down, but it's just to show you guys how if you're upping your displacement scale, you do want to make sure you're upping your maximum displacement. And so for this, I might just sort of do like a 0.5. Oh, no, not 0.5. So I don't want anything too like heavy going on. And I mean, realistically, I probably don't even need to have displacement on here because the shot is quite far out. But, you know, this will come in handy if you're, I don't know, if you're creating like a nice landscape or a nice terrain and you want to have, you have like a displacement map and you want to just sort of like really like bump up this displacement scale, then just make sure that you know, up your maximum displacement as well.
Hey, Elly?
Yes.
This is like a noob question. I'll pretend that somebody else asked this question, but so what I'm used to with displacement, because I think like the displacer object in Cinema does this, the displacer disformer, like it actually displaces the geometry, and like that's kind of like what I'm like used to with materials as well. Is this doing the same thing, or is this kind of like a bump map where it's kind of like a fake thing?
So it's a little bit of a combination of both. So as we can see, it's not actually displacing our geometry inside of our viewport. So, you know, when you use the displacer deformer, it actually displaces our geometry, right? It does that.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas what this does, because it's a texture effect, it's not displacing our actual geometry, but it does displace it inside of our render view. And so this is a really cool trick to basically simulate the same effect, but it's going to be quicker because we're not displacing our geometry. So we're not having to worry about, so for example, like, you know, when you're making a landscape in like C4D and you're putting a displacer on it or a displacement effect, and you have to up your segments, right, to get it nice and cool and make it look good, you just up those segments. You could do the exact same thing inside of the Redshift shader graph, throw that same like displacement, whatever you're using, whether it's a noise or whether it's like an actual displacement map, put it inside the texture here, and then you could have like a plane of like one segment, and it's inside of here, you're going to see it working in the same way, and it's going to be faster because you're not having to worry about the actual geometry.
But then you're not like casting shadows and like responding to light in the same way, right? Or no?
Yes. So inside of here, like, we'll notice when we mess with one of the final textures, when we do those like grungy wall tiles, you'll notice when we then add the displacement, we then get our accurate reflections and shadows based on that displacement.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, if you work with a lot of displacement, then, and you're worried about like things always taking ages in like your viewport, I would say, okay, so if we're going to play like devil's advocate here, the downside is you don't see it in your viewport. So for example, if I'm building like a big terrain and a landscape and I want to put objects on it and models on it, that's when I would personally say build it in your viewport and build it in your geometry, because it just makes things easier instead of having to like adjust your models in the viewport and looking at the render view, because the render view is where you see your displacement. Does that make sense?
That makes tons of sense.
Yeah.
Thank
so
you
there's a
much.
purpose for like each one, really, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
Cool. Do we actually have any other questions? This is probably like a good time that we could like stop and answer a couple of questions, because we've kind of got to like the point where we've added this first texture, we've looked at bump and displacement and how we can connect some of those together. If there are any sort of questions related to this, like we can cover those.
So there are billions of questions, as always, for these sessions about Redshift, and everything from like your computer specs to all the advanced things that people want to know about Redshift. But as far as the things that you're actually talking about, like, yeah, you'll probably want to go back through and add some of these questions to the Q&A, because it's above my my understanding. My apologies to everyone in the chat that wants to know all this stuff about Redshift that I don't know, but Elly will
we could always
graciously answer you.
Do you know what I might do? I could even see if we can finish like a few minutes early and answer like some of these questions. Also, regarding my machine, this is what I'm running on i7 Mac with a Running Pro 5700 XT. And it works pretty well. Works pretty well for me. So for anyone who wanted to know, that's exactly how. It's the machine that I'm running on. Cool. Yeah, what I'll do, I might even like stop and have a little look at some of those questions a little bit later on. But you know, hopefully some of those questions might get answered over the next few textures. So one final thing.
I find that often what happens is like people, like, you'll start talking about a thing and then people will ask questions about it and then you will answer them like after.
Yes,
like as you
hopefully. Go. But yeah, by all means, I will go back through all the questions again, and we'll do that Q&A, because I think that's going to be super handy, just for everyone as well, I think. But yeah, I'll see if I can add some little time at the end to do that.
Bless you. And my apologies to everyone for my lack of knowledge about Redshift.
No, it's all good. It's all good. So one final thing I do want to show on here, because, you know, the reason that we love nodes is because they're so powerful and they allow us to do even like the smallest of things really, really easily. So we've created this material, right? We've got this. But for me, what you'll notice in the final one, my planks are actually vertical, they're not horizontal. And so what we can do, we can come into our texture nodes, and this is where we can control our scaling, our offset, and our rotation. And so we can enter, you know, a value of 90 degrees, and it's going to rotate my planks to 90. But if I wanted to do that with all of my textures, I could do it on each individual one, or I could highlight them all and change it. But the downside to this is if I then use this material again on a different object, the rotation or the scaling may need to be changed again. And so it's going to mean I've got to go back in again, I've got to change them. And it doesn't sound like a long-winded process, but we can actually set a couple of things up to make these things really easy to change and update. And so let's have a look at how we can do that. So if we have a look at our texture node input, so at the moment we've only been worried about their output. Let's have a look at their input. So we can adjust and we can input all of the different settings inside of here, just like we can in the Redshift material. And the final option, we have scale, offset, and rotation. And so what that means is we can use mathematical nodes, and don't worry, we're not getting into math because that is definitely not my strong suit, but we can use mathematical nodes to control and enter values for these textures. So we have something called a constant, and a constant is a really simple little node with not a lot of options in, but it has got this value option. And so what I can do, so because I know I want to enter a rotation value of 90, because that's what we just saw, so that's going to rotate it to make it vertical, right? I'm going to enter a value of 90 in my constant. And for the sake of this, I'm just going to call it rotate. So now what I'm going to do, I'm going to plug this into my rotate inputs of all of my texture maps, because this is the important thing. You know, if you change like rotation or scale of one texture map, you're going to want to change it to them all. And so now I can come in, I can change this to make them horizontal, or I can change it to make them vertical. And so now if I put this on a different like surface or a different object, I don't have to worry about going back into here. I can just really quickly change this. And we can even use this for my scale. So let me enter a value of 1, because that's our default. So if we have a look at our scale, my default is a value of 1. Let me just plug this into here, plug this into here. So it's a little bit of like a, you know, it takes a bit of a setup, but once it's done, it's done. You don't have to worry about it again. Smooth it out the way. And so now what I can do, I'm going to enter just like a different value. So if I enter a value of 2, it's basically just going to multiply this texture map across my surface. And then again, let me go to something like 4 actually, because I think that's what I ended up with. And so now what we have like 4 times these texture maps across the surface of my object or of my model. And so I really like this sort of setup. And so I'll be totally honest with you guys, I don't do it all of the time. Like I don't always have this set up, but it's really handy, especially if you use the same textures. So build them once like this, fix your rotate, scale and offset for all texture maps. And then whatever you then use them on, all you have to do is come in and just adjust these really, like you might need to adjust like these settings as well. But this is like a really like quick way of working if you like repeat the same textures and same materials. Okay, cool. So that was our first material, and that was our most simple material because it's using our texture maps. All we're using is color, roughness, normal, and displacement. And we've now got that on here. And we looked at how we can start to set and connect some of these materials together and some of these different texture maps on top of our standard Redshift material node. And I think it looks quite nice. Like I'm liking how this texture looks. So now let's move on to a slightly different material. And we're going to set this up in a bit of a different way. And so let's just create again a Redshift material. And this time we're going to be creating the like metal table, metal tabletop. And so what we're going to do, we're going to call it scratched metal table. I'm trying to keep these the same names as I used in the final, but hey, some of them might be a little bit different. So what we're going to do, we're going to drop that on here, and we're going to kick this off. Let's have a look at this. Right, okay, cool. So the way that we're going to create this is we're actually going to take advantage. So I don't know if everyone will remember that when we looked through our Redshift material node in part 1, we actually took a look, I think, at least I hope, at some of the different presets. So inside of our base properties, yeah.
Can I interrupt really
Yeah.
quick? A few different people in the chat have had the comment like, how do I get to the shader graph? And apparently when they create a material, it's not coming up or something. Like, and so we've kind of gone through in the chat about like, oh, we got to create a Redshift material and they're double clicking. And like a few people have said like, that's not coming up for me or something. Is there like kind of like a common reason why that wouldn't come up, or that you'd be looking at something else or something?
No, it should be. However, there is another way to bring it up. So inside of the Redshift menu, at the pretty much the very bottom, there is the Redshift shader graph editor. And so if you open that up and then click one of your materials, it should update to then show that material there. But yeah, really, it should, like, I'm literally just double clicking and it opens up, but try opening up this way.
That's a cool bonus trick.
Yeah, so I'll just do that again just for sort of like the benefit. So Redshift menu at the top, Redshift shader graph editor, because that's what we're working in. We're working in this shader graph editor. And then whatever material you have selected, it should update. If you haven't got one selected, it'll be grey, but then just click that. So hopefully that fixes it. If there are a couple of people who aren't able to see that.
I love that.
I'm just gonna cool. And I'm gonna dock it again just for the sake of this. And let's make a little bit more room. This is the real kind of like battle between wanting to have enough render view space and enough shader graph space for you guys to see everything. But hopefully this is good enough for everyone to see pretty much everything that's going on. So so we've just created a standard material and we've thrown that onto our tabletop. And what we're going to do, we're going to actually use one of our preset materials. And I love using this material because I say it very different to the Americans. And so we're going to be using the aluminium preset. And what I love about this, what I love about using these presets, is it just means I don't have to worry about coming down and adjusting my reflections based on the material that I want to create. So I want this nice metal tabletop, right? So I would need my BRDF to be GGX. And my Fresnel type, I like to work in color, edge, and tint because it's a nice like artist friendly way, unless you're working with like a Metalness map. And if you are, change it to Metalness and make sure you plug it in there. But for me, I'm going to stick with color, edge, and tint because it's just a nice way of working. And so using these presets are really nice kind of base starting point for building up these textures. And what we're going to do, so this time, so because I'm using this base aluminium material, I'm now just going to add some surface imperfections. So a lot of you guys have probably noticed that if you look at textures or you're trying to make realistic looking textures, we love surface imperfections, don't we? We love scratches, we love like fingerprints, we love like dirt maps. And so I thought I'd create this table to be, I want it to look like it's worn and a bit rough and a little bit dented. And so what I'm going to do, I'm going to create this material based off this base aluminium, and I'm just going to use a couple of different texture maps in the asset browser, and it's going to just completely change how cool this texture looks. So what do we want to do first? So let me just take a look at this. So we're going to scratch metal, right? Cool. So inside of our asset browser, so I'm just going to click that little kind of cloud in a box, and I'm going to grab a dirt map first. So I'm just going to use my little search bar and I'm going to type in the word dirt. And what I love about Cinema 4D's asset browser is we have so many cool different dirt maps. First of all, they're 4K. Second of all, they're tileable. So like they are really, really good to use. And believe me, I use them in a lot of my materials and a lot of my textures. So what I'm going to do, which dirt map do I want to use? I think it's like the 6th one. I think it's this one here. So the way that we can bring these into our shader graph is really simply, we can just drag and drop them and they're going to come into our shader graph. It's going to say, do you want to do a path? No, I don't. And it comes in again inside a texture node. And I'm just going to title this, what was it? Was it .06? Title it .06. And that's just for me just so it looks a little bit neater than all of those random little letters. Okay, right, so what do we want to do? So the first thing I want to do, I'm going to actually use this particular texture map to control my roughness values. So you know how we were using that wooden plank roughness map, and it looks at the white and the black values? I'm going to do the same thing with this texture map here, and it's going to look at my white and black values, and it's going to be controlling my roughness input based on these values. So first things first, I like to see how my texture maps are projecting onto the surface of my object. And so what I like to do, I like to plug it straight into my surface. And that way we get to see exactly how this looks. We can see our white and black values, and we can also see our projection. And so hopefully we can all see, let me maybe come in a little bit closer here, that the top is looking pretty nice. The side, however, is looking very, very stretchy. And so this means basically that our dirt texture isn't projecting on top of my object properly. And so what we can do, we can come into here, which some of us may have done before in the past with Cinema 4D material tags, come into your material tag, and we can fix our projection. So we can adjust this, and I know Cubic's going to fix it, but for the sake of this, I don't want to be adjusting my projection in here. I want to be able to show you a very cool node. So I'm going to change it back to UV mapping, because the trouble is, if you have a more advanced object or model, sometimes these projection types just aren't suitable. And sometimes it involves, unwrapping the model, which some of us can be quite difficult, or we're not really sure how to do. And so inside of Redshift, there is a very lovely node that we can use that basically sort of does like an automatic UV projection for us, and it's going to fix this texture being projected on top of our surface. And that node is called a TriPlanar. So we have a TriPlanar node. So let me pull this in here. And so let's see exactly how this TriPlanar works. And so what I'm going to do, I'm going to plug this into the surface, and everything's going to go red. Everything's going to go bright red. Let me just come up here so we can see everything. And let's then click my TriPlanar and have a look at our different settings in here. So we have a same image on each axis checkbox, and then we have image X being represented by this red color. And so what exactly does this mean? What's happening? So let's actually uncheck same image on each axis, and it's gonna demonstrate what exactly the TriPlanar can do. So if I uncheck this, we now have a different color for our different axis. We have our x-axis being this red color, we have our y-axis being this green color, and we have our z-axis being this blue color. And if we look at our TriPlanar inputs, in particular our texture inputs, we can now see that we have an image X, Y, and Z. And what this means is we could plug in a different texture image to each of these different axes, and then we can blend them using this blend amount. So if we have a look at this particular area here, and I start to up this blend amount, we can see that we're getting this really nice sort of like smooth blending happening. And so what we can do with this TriPlanar, let me just pull this back down, we can leave same image on each axis on, because we're only wanting to use this one dirt texture, and we want it to be projected across the entire of our object, so across all axes. We can then plug it into our TriPlanar. So remember, this is how it looked before. Now I'm going to plug it into my image X. So remember, we've changed it to same image on each axis. So now these are grayed out because our texture map is plugged into them, our dirt map. And now when I plug that into my surface, it completely fixes that projection for us. And this is a super handy node, and you'll find like throughout most of these materials that we create today, we will probably be using this TriPlanar because we're using texture maps. So that is definitely a handy trick when it comes to working with these texture maps, and especially if you're using like more advanced objects and models. So let's plug this back into here. Plug our like aluminium back into here.
Hey, Elly.
Yeah.
I got a wacky question that you could just like feel free to ignore. But like, you know, in cinema, you know, the color coding of the icons tells you like, you know, what kind of object it is. And so I'm noticing that like in Redshift, you know, the texture nodes are all this kind of like golden color, and then there's like displacement and TriPlanar are purple, and you got the material that's red and the output's blue. And I wonder, is there a simple motif there? Is there something that's like easily explainable about where the colors are coming from?
Yeah, so they actually relate to the category of node that they are a part of. So let me pull this up. Oh, wrong one. Let's pull that back up there. So what you can see here is we have our different, so these are like our top level categories. So we have like materials, and these are therefore our different material nodes. So what you'll notice is these are our material base nodes. And so those are the same thing there. We then have like texture nodes. So for different things, so we can see we have a little Maxon noise, which we'll be looking at in a little bit. And so the colors all kind of relate. And so we have like utilities. They all relate to the kind of the top level category.
Okay.
But we can actually, if you do want to, you can change the color of these if you want to. You just have to go into the basic property of the node, and you can adjust those if you want to.
Cool. Awesome. Thank you.
No worries. So let me pull this back down there. Oh, it's looking great. Kick that off again. All right, cool. So where were we at? Right, cool. Yeah, so we've fixed our projection. We've fixed our depth projection. And again, order of process, our texture map comes first, and then we want to fix its projection. So our TriPlanar comes after. And now what we're going to do, we're going to use this dirt map and this texture map to be controlling our roughness. So what we're going to do, we're going to plug our TriPlanar now, which is kind of taking everything, and we're going to plug it into our reflection roughness. Oh, I didn't kick that off. And let's sort of come into here. And so now what's happening is we're controlling our roughness values with the black and white values of our dirt texture map. And so where all of our kind of white areas are, we're having a more rough surface, and where all of our sort of like darker black or grey areas, we're having a more glossy sort of area. But let's say we want to control these a little bit more. So for me, I actually want this to look a bit more like metal, a bit more glossy. So I want to actually change this texture map slightly. But instead of having to like download it, opening it in Photoshop, adjusting my levels or my curves, we can actually do this directly inside of the shader graph. And that is using a really great node called a ramp node. And the ramp node has so many purposes. I could probably sit here for the next kind of like half an hour and talk about how you can use it to colorize. We can use it to create gradients. We can use it to, as Chad said earlier, to invert textures and colors as well. And we can also use it to control and sort of dial in our black and white values. And that's what we're going to be doing with it for this texture. So I'm going to drag and drop my ramp in. And what we need to do, we need to just make a little bit of space. So our texture comes first, and then our TriPlanar. But then before it gets to my reflection roughness input, we want to actually adjust these values. So let's plug this straight into our surface so we can see these black and white values again. And then what we're going to do, I'm going to plug it into my ramp. And what's really great about the ramp is we only have one input, and that's the input. So I'm going to select my input, and then I'm actually going to plug this straight into my surface. And what you'll notice is nothing actually happens, and that's because we haven't actually adjusted anything in here. And so we have our texture space and our source, which is set to auto. And for us, auto works really nicely, and it works perfectly well. We have a mapping type, which is something you may be used to, you know, inside of standard Cinema 4D materials and the material tag. We can map things vertically, horizontal. Like this works if you're like working with gradients, right? You can adjust your mapping type. This adjustment setting, so this invert is how we would invert our black and white values, but I'm not going to do it now because I'm going to be doing it on the next material. I think. Oh, actually, maybe even this one. We'll see. We then have a noise amount and frequency. And the best way to describe this is inside of C4D materials, if you've used the turbulence mode, where you get that nice kind of like turbulent effect and you get that nice noisy effect, this is that same sort of setting. And then we have our ramp here, our color ramp, and we can use this to colorize our textures. But for me, because I want to use it to control and dial in my black and white values, I'm going to leave my knots or my handles as black and white. And so what we're going to do, if you take a look at my render view, so at the moment we have this whole setup plugged into my surface, so we can just see these values now. And if I start to pull my black handle across, my black knot across, you'll see that we're really pushing and increasing those black values. And we know that these black values directly relate to our roughness value of 0. Therefore, the more black we have on this texture, the more kind of shiny metal we're going to have. So let's pull this back and let's see how it's working inside of the actual roughness. So let's connect everything together now. And if we keep an eye on our render view, come back to our ramp, and then we start to really push our black values, we're now having more of these sort of shiny, glossy, less rough areas. And if I sort of put it all the way across, we can really see it. We're getting like very, very few of these sort of like rough patches. So that's one great purpose for the ramp. Let me just sort of pull this back. We don't want to like, maybe we go, where do we want to go? You know, all this is like artistic personal preference at the end of the day. So maybe I'm going to leave it at that. I like it looking a little bit like dingy and dirty, like it's some old like calf. So yeah, I like that. That's cool. Okay, cool. Right. So what next? What do we want to do now? So I'm not going to leave it there. I'm actually going to now add some. Let's add like some dents or like some scratches. And so the way that we can do that, I mean, there's a variety of different ways. There's the great thing about Node, the great thing about Redshift. There's multiple different ways to do things, much like there is inside of C4D. But what I'm going to do, I'm going to actually blend some materials together, and then I'm going to use a grayscale map as a layer mask. And this is going to be similar to like a layer mask in Photoshop, where you see things on like or some things get hidden based on like black and white values. So I'm going to work backwards for this, and just because I think it helps break it down a little bit better. And so the way that we can blend materials together is, if we type in material, we have our normal material node, which is this one here, and we have something called a material blender. So let's just drag this material blender inside of here, and let's take a look. Let's take an actual look at it. So we have 6 different layers, all that have a blend color inside of here. And what this allows us to do, this allows us to combine or blend different textures or different materials, and then we can use a black and white texture as a mask, or in our case, as a blend color. And so let's actually see how this works with some plain textures. So I'm just going to create a plain red texture, and I'm going to create, so to duplicate, by the way, I just realized I totally skipped over that. To duplicate a node, all you have to do is hold the command key, maybe control if you're on a Mac, if you're on a PC, and then click and drag. So we click and drag, and we just get duplicates. And then we're going to do like a blue. And so what I'm going to do, so my red is going to be my base color. So this is going to be like my starting color. I'm going to plug that into there. And so we can see everything's gone red, right? And then my blue is going to be my second color, or my second layer. So I'm going to plug that into my input, and it's going to be it's called layer color 1 because technically your base material is like your first color. So then we do my layer color 1, and then nothing happens. We don't see anything. We can only see our red. And that's because we need to define our mask. And our mask is going to basically tell Redshift where we want to have our red areas of our base color and where we want to have our blue areas, which is our layer color 1. And so to demo this is a nice little way of me showing you an extra little node inside of Redshift. And so if you're used to working inside of C4D, you're probably very used to working with Maxon noises. And as you know, they are a great asset to work with. They're extremely powerful, and they're just like extremely cool to make procedural materials, to make displacement, like me and Chad were talking about earlier. They have a lot of different functionality. And we are lucky enough to actually have Maxon noise inside of our Redshift shader graph. And so let me just pull this inside of here. And so you'll be used to all of these different settings inside here and all of these different noises as well. So I'm not going to worry about going into too much detail about this particular node. I just wanted to be able to kind of show you guys that we do have Maxon noises inside of Redshift, as well as normal Redshift noises as well. So let me plug this.
Is there an advantage? Like I haven't played with Redshift noise at all. Is it? I get the impression just because Maxon noise is like so lovely and full featured that like that's just kind of like where I would go, and that's like the one I'm more familiar with. Is there like a reason to use like the Redshift noise? Is there something sexier about it in some cases, or just kind of like always stick with the Maxon noise?
I guess it's kind of personal preference. Like you said, the Maxon noise, if it's something you're used to and you're familiar, and you do have a lot more kind of noise types. So if you sort of just pull in like the normal Redshift noise, we have slightly less noise types. So we have fractal, turbulence, and cell. Those are our only options. But we do have then the ability to control like complexity and like frequency and things like that. But yeah, I would say one isn't better than the other. Maxon noise, you probably have there because of the amount of noise types. There are probably more possibilities with Maxon noises. And also if people are used to building like procedural materials with noises, then absolutely Maxon noises is probably the way to go. But, you know, of course, there's no harm in having a little look at Redshift noise as well.
That's cool. I mean, Maxon noise does feel like it's a lot better. I mean, just objectively, it does seem cool.
You have to say that. Maybe we'll do a poll at the end. I think everyone would agree though. Cool, right, yeah, so let's take a look. So I'm not really gonna, you know, as I said, I'm not really gonna worry about actually looking at this Maxon noise because I'm sure a lot of you are already used to that. But I'm just gonna sort of plug it into the surface just so we can see how this is projecting on here. And I'm gonna use this to demonstrate how this material blend actually works. I'm gonna up my contrast just so we have some more black and white values. And now what we're gonna do, I'm gonna use this black and white noise as our sort of like blending color 1. And the best way to think of this is just as like a blending like layer mask. That's why I always call it a blending mask. But I am talking about the blend color 1. So what we can see is where we have these white areas, we're getting our blue texture or our second layer coming through. And when we have those black areas, we're getting our base color. And so with this knowledge and this information, we can now use like, I don't know, our dirt maps or our scratch maps or whatever to now blend between different materials on top of the surface and start to create some really like cool looking imperfect textures. So what we're going to do, let me just delete all of this. And that material that we just made, so you know the aluminium with the dirt roughness over the top, that's going to be our base color. And let me just sort of reorganize this a little bit better. And the way that we want to think about it is, let's say this was like a real table in like a cafe, and you sort of like you dented it or you scratched some of like this top metal paint or surface off. You would then have a second surface underneath, right? You'd have like a second texture or second material. And the way that we need to like think about this is we therefore need to create this second layer or this second surface, which is then going to be showing through. And so what we have to do, we have to grab another material node So we have our base material here, which is our like sort of rough aluminium. And then I'm just going to keep it simple. I'm just going to create like a dark metal. So, you know, change my diffuse color, like nothing fancy. We go GGX, color, edge and tint. And then if we plug that into our surface, we can see like, this is what it looks like. So nothing fancy, but this is going to work as like our underneath material. And so we plug that back in. And now that material we just made, so that darker material, is going to be our layer color 1. And then now what we want to do, because we want to make like dents or scratches, I'm going to come into my asset browser again, and I'm going to grab a sort of like, I'm going to grab some scratches. So I think there's one called non-directional, which are going to work really great for us. Non-directional, here we go. So I'm going to grab this texture map here, and this is what I'm going to use as my blend color 1, aka my blending mask. So again, just going to drag and drop that in, and we're going to just for the sake of this, non-directional scratch. Also, I'm definitely not normally this organized, so don't feel like you need to change the name of your things. I'm just doing it to make it a bit easier for us all. But yeah, I don't want any false pretenses, because I am probably the least organized user of C4D and Redshift, just as a little disclaimer there for everyone to know. So let's take these scratches, and now we're going to use them as our blending mask. But the first thing I'm going to want to do, I want to check my projection first. This is very important, otherwise it's all going to look a little bit strange. So I'm going to plug this into my surface. And so we can see again, we're getting some of this strange stretching going on, just like we did with our dirt map that is all the way over here. And so again, we just want to grab our TriPlanar node, and we want to put that in between here, just so we get that fixing going on. Okay, cool, so it's fixed that. And, you know, we could also come in, we could adjust our scaling and our rotation if we want to, but for the purposes of time, I'm not going to do that. So I'm going to connect my material blender back in. So at the moment we have our base material, our rough aluminium, and then we have that plain kind of like dark metal gray color. And now we're going to use this scratch as our blend color 1. Okay, cool. It's looking a little bit strange. And that's because our colors are kind of being masked the wrong way. And this is where, Chad, you were saying about, oh, how would you invert your black and white values? This would be the best time to then need to do that. And so the way that we can do that is we can use another ramp node. And so as I said, you know, the ramp serves multiple purposes inside of Redshift. So we're going to grab ourselves a ramp node, and we want to make sure, again, it's between our TriPlanar and then whatever the next node is. In our case, is going to be in a material blender. We're going to plug that in, and then we're going to plug that into our blend color. And then all we need to do, super simple, hit that invert button, and then it does its magic. And it's just inverted the black and white values of our texture really, really simply and really easily. And then the best thing of using the reasons to why we use the ramp as opposed to the color invert node, which would also do the same thing, is because we can invert it and then we can still adjust our black and white values if we want to. So the ramp just serves like a dual purpose, really. Cool. So let's take a look. So that is actually the scratched metal material. So inside of the final one, there is another extra layer, I think, of scratches inside, but you know, we're not going to worry about that. I'd rather get into creating some of the other materials. You can always go back through the final one and see exactly how each one was broken down, but this was the majority of it. So this time we looked at how we can add some surface imperfections. So we added our scratches and we added our dirt, and we had them controlling different things. We then looked at how the TriPlanar is able to kind of like automatically fix that projection for us, which is super handy, especially if we're working with like advanced models. I mean, in this case, I'm very aware that we're not, but I did want to just demonstrate it so you guys get the benefit of that knowledge. We then looked at the ramp and how we looked at its two of its purposes. So the first one was we looked at dialing in our black and white values and really pushing and pulling those. And then we also looked at how it can invert our textures. And then finally we looked at our Redshift material blender and how we can blend together different materials and different textures using a blend color or a blending mask, which in our case was our scratch map. Okay, right. So what have we got? Oh my goodness, we've got 45 minutes left.
Can I have two quick questions?
Yeah.
Is there a way to, because the blend color kind of blends everything in the same way all together. Is there kind of like a quick procedural way? And maybe this is just a yes or no question and not like an explanation because it's going to take too long. But is there like a quick, dirty procedural way to kind of like create like a great, like let's say you wanted the center of the table to be more scuffed up or something like that. Is there a way to kind of create gradients, shapes, that type of thing to kind of like confine the blending to certain areas rather than just kind of like a noise map that covers the whole surface?
Yeah, so there would be like a couple of different ways of doing that. So one cool way of doing that would be if you work with like alphas. So for example, let's say you had like a particular alpha of something of like let's say like the Maxon logo, and you wanted the Maxon logo then to be the mask of where all of this like messiness happens. You could do that. Mm-hmm. Or if it was a simple case of just creating like shapes, mm-hmm. you could use the ramp for it. And so if I just plug the ramp straight into like the surface of this, and then we go like, I don't know, like circular. And then I know this isn't like super probably what you had in mind.
No, it totally is.
But we could like do that, and then we could then adjust. Could I adjust that if I put it into a texture? So we could then like adjust like the offset of this, for example, and then the ramp could become my blend color.
Right.
So if that is, it's not super obvious because I've got like imperfect textures as opposed to like just like the red and the blue.
Totally.
You could use that to then kind of be between the two. Like, would I be able to do this better if I do it like this? Maybe so we can see it. There we go. We can see it a bit better. So you could use maybe the ramp for that with a different mapping mode and then offset it. But there would be like, yeah, there would be loads of different ways of being able to define kind of exactly where you'd want that. And like, I could talk about this for ages because we could use what's called a curvature node. And so if you have like an object that's got, you know, sort of like dents and details like on the inside, you can use the curvature, and we could then make it look like there's like a build-up of like rust or dirt inside of those little like crevices, and use that as the blending mask. Oh,
wow,
there's so many. I know there's so much stuff that we could talk about. But yeah, there's so many like possibilities with this kind of blending mode.
Okay, so that leads to my other quick question. Like, let's say you set up this like node tree, and I'm guessing this is like a fairly simple node tree compared to like how things like might normally get. But yeah, like, let's say you go all this effort getting the TriPlanar and all the noise business going, and let's say you like this as a preset. Like, can you save this out as a material? Can you save like each individual node, like the settings for that node as a preset, or like how does that work if I want to save?
Yeah. So you can actually do both. So you can do both. Oh, okay. So let's say inside this Redshift material here, let's say I spent ages tweaking like all of these little settings in here, and I was like, yeah, cool, that's like the sweetest looking metal I've ever made in my life. We can come into our Redshift material here, and up in here, this just to let people know, this is a R25 feature. Pretty sure it's R25 feature. We can come down, and as you can see here, I've already got some. I can save this as a preset, call it like, I don't know, like best metal ever or something. Press OK. And then next time I add a material in, I can come in and I can go, I don't need to press that, and do my drop down and go, yeah, best metal ever. And it will actually update and give me all of those settings inside of there. So that's one way, but that is one node. It doesn't save this whole kind of like node tree. It's just an individual node. If we want to save the whole material, we can actually just come into our lovely asset browser, and then we can go to add materials to database, and we can add and create our own material database that way. And so that would be like version 24 or version 25, if just in case people are on previous ones. But yeah, so we can see as well, like we have our presets saved into here. So I've got my best metal ever in here now as well. And we can even kind of like set it as like a favorite or as the main one. And so that every time I add a material node, it's gonna use that custom preset. I mean, that might not be the best thing. But you can do that if you want to.
That's awesome. Thank you.
No worries.
Great answer to that question. That was like my birthday.
Okay, cool. So, oh god, there were so many different materials I wanted to make. I don't think we're gonna have time, but let's just see what we get to. Let's see what we get to. Okay, cool. So material number 3 is let's create the grungy wall material, because this like kind of accumulates the previous 2 setups that we just looked at, and it sort of like just sort of like combines them all together. And so what did I want to do? So grungy wall textures. So let's create a Redshift material, and for the purposes of being organized, grunged wall tiles _rs. And we'll drop that on here. So let's get into here. And so what I'm going to do, I'm going to cheekily cheat a little bit. And that's only because this grunge wall texture actually starts off by using just like a base diffuse color. So I'm just going to copy that color. And I'm going to paste that in here just to make life a little bit easier, just so it looks nice and similar. And so this is sort of like our base. This is our base material. We're not going to worry about changing anything else because, you know, we're creating sort of like a tile material, like it's sort of like a ceramic. So we can leave this on Beckman if we leave our Fresnel type on IOR for this. So I'm going to take this moment to be able to show you another node inside of the shader graph. However, so we're going to basically use this to create our tiles. However, this isn't the actual process that I did. So I'm going to show you this, and then I'm going to like show you the actual way that I made it. But it's a nice way of being able to show you guys a different set of nodes. So if you're used to using Cinema 4D, you will be used to the C4D shaders. And so Redshift was kind enough to add the C4D shaders to our shader graph for us to use. And so what we can do, we can have a look at our C4D shader in here, and we have access to all of these lovely different shaders, which some of you may be used to, you know, if you're used to working inside of C4D and C4D's materials. And so what we're going to do, we're going to grab our tiles. And don't worry, I'm going to change all this in a little bit, but we're going to look at this setup first. We're going to look at how these work together. So with my C4D shader node, if I pull out my texture, what you might notice is my little branch doesn't go green. It goes grey. And that's because we need to do one little step first before we can actually connect this to our Redshift material. And that is we have to connect the C4D shader to a texture, to a Redshift texture node. And this is going to allow us to take advantage of our C4D shader. So the thing is, we only have one little input, and that's our texture 0 when we're using our shader, which is really handy, so we don't accidentally put it in the wrong thing. And then we can put our output color. Let's just put it onto our surface. And it looks super ugly at the moment. And that's because we just need to adjust our shader. So for a start, we do actually need to adjust our width and height. And this is like our resolution. So I'm just going to go 512, 512 for now. And I'm going to adjust my tiles and the way that these look. And so what I'm going to do, basically, to explain, I'm going to use the C4D tile shader to create almost like a tile bump map. So a black and white tile map, and we're going to plug it into a bump, and we're going to plug it into our bump input, and it's going to give that nice impression of tiles. And so how do we do this? So I just want all my tile colors to be white. So I'm just going to copy and paste these just really easily. We're going to sort of drop that in there. Then my grout width, I think I went like 1 by 1. And then maybe I want them to be kind of more square. And so maybe 50 by 100. And then maybe we do global scale of like 300. Okay, cool. Yeah, that works. Cool, yeah, so I'm happy with that. And then what's really great is inside of our Redshift texture. So all of that was done inside of our C4D shader. Now I can come into my texture. Once I've decided that I like this, like this sort of scaling, I can still come into my remap here and I can adjust my offset, or I can adjust my scaling again in here if I want to, once I've sort of really defined how I've got my shade looking. Cool, so we have that set up. And so now let's look at connecting this to our bump. So again, we know that we need to grab a bump node. Oh, let me just sort of move this up so I can see everything a bit better. We're going to grab our bump map. And so I'm sort of going to speed over some of this stuff because we've already looked at, adding a bump map and how we connect those together. So we know that we want our texture into our input and therefore we want our output into our overall bump input. Excellent. Now we have our tiles. And you know what? They're actually not looking too bad. I think that could work. That could work. And so this is a really cool way if you want to use the C4D shaders, if you're used to using them, if you want to make tiles like cool, like brickwork, all that kind of stuff, you can absolutely do so using the shader graph. You just need to make sure you plug it into an RS texture first. So as I said, this isn't actually the way that I created these tiles, even though I probably should have done, because it's actually I like how it looks. I ended up using a tile map. So I use a tile normal map. And the only reason I like it is I get this really nice detail in here, which we absolutely could make inside of the shader graph now, but it would be a slightly longer process, sort of combining and layering maybe some noises inside of here. So for this, sorry, C4D shader node, you've been dropped. And we're just going to grab our 2 4K tile texture maps. And we're going to drag and drop those in the same way as we've been doing our texture maps inside of here. Okay, right, so we're going to move our displacement out of the way. We don't really need to worry about that. And we're going to rebuild this. So again, because we're using a normal map, we do want to change this to raw. And then with our bump map, again, because we're using a normal map, we want to be changing it to tangent space normal. And then we can plug this into here, and then we can plug this into our bump input. So we've just basically done the exact same thing we just did, bump map into bump input. But as we can see, we don't have the correct scaling. Or I mean, if you want tiles that look like this, then you do have the correct scaling. But for me, I want nice square ones. And so I'm going to come into my texture map. And I'm going to just drop my scale to like 0.5. And that works perfectly for me. So let's leave that there. So yeah, cool. Right. So we've got our tiles. And so what I want to do, I want to start to build this up. And I want to start to make some kind of like dingy looking, dirty tiles. And the way that we're going to do that is we're going to use that same method of using the Material Blender. And the way that we want to think about it is when, let's say this was a real cafe. When they first put these tiles up, they looked lovely, they were bright, they were nice and glossy, they were nice and fresh. And so that's what we do first. That's the bit that we create first. And we've done that. We've made our nice, lovely, yellow, glossy tiles. And now what we want to do, the next step, is to start building up our dirt and imperfections like how it would happen in the real world. So like the longer these tiles are on the wall and the more people come into this cafe, the dirtier and grimier they're going to get. And we're basically going to do that now. We're going to make that. And so what I'm going to do, I'm going to work backwards because I like to when working with a Material Blender. I'm going to grab my Material Blender first. And this just helps me to set things up correctly. And we're going to ignore our displacement for now. We're not really fussed about that. So we have our nice, fresh, lovely yellow tiles. that is therefore going to become our base color, and that's going to go into our surface. And then what I want to do is I want to add another material. And what I'm going to do, I'm actually just going to duplicate this material because I want to create like some dingy looking drips and sort of like grimy looking drips like we had on the original or like the final scene file. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to come into my color and I'm actually just going to, this is in the way a little bit, make them a little bit sort of like a darker color. And I'm going to plug that, and that's going to be my layer color 1. So it's going to be my second material or second color. And then what I'm going to do, I'm going to grab a different texture map, and this is probably one of my favorite texture maps, my most overused one. It's this Dirt 7. And if you look at this, I love this. The detail, I think it looks really cool. And when you throw it on like a wall or tiles, it gives that impression of like dirty drips, which I think is going to work really well for like the aesthetic that I'm going for. So let me just drag this inside of here. And then what was this? Dirt 07. Dirt 07. And what we're going to do, we're going to use this as our blending mask. So all we're going to do is drop that into my blending mask here. And again, we can see that this needs to be inverted. So we're getting sort of like the wrong colors here. Where I want my drips to be kind of like the dingy color, and I want everything else to remain this sort of like nice yellowy color. So again, we can use good old ramp node, and we can just plug that straight into here. And then we want to invert it. And if you want to, we can adjust these handles, but I'm not really going to worry about that just now. But if you do want to, this is where you would do it inside your ramp node. Okay, cool. So we've got our base color, we've got our nice looking glossy tiles. We've then added our dingy looking material, and we've then masked that out by using this dirt texture here. What we can also do, we can take advantage of this setup, and we can actually plug this into our original reflection roughness. So now what's going to happen, we're going to have some nice sort of like glossiness where the drips aren't, and where they are, we're going to have some nice roughness because we're using this same setup. And we can take this even further and begin to build this up even more. So let's grab a bump map, and now let's use this sort of like black and white texture here, and let's use it to control the bump of this second dingy material. And so this is where you're kind of like your creativity can come into play. Once you know how some of these nodes go together, and once you know how these different things like bump works and reflection works, we can just build this up and up and up as much as we want to. So I plug that into my bump now. We now have this dirt texture controlling the roughness on our original material, the bump on our second material, and the blend of our whole kind of like setup. And so this one setup here is like serving 3 different input purposes now for us. All we've had to do is just plug it into the different ones. We haven't had to set it all up again, which is another sort of benefit of working with nodes. And so now let's do even more. So this is looking a little bit unneat at the moment, but hey ho. Let's do a little bit more. Let's now create some like cool looking scratches as well. And so in order to do so, we're going to grab our third material. And just to keep it, for the sake of keeping it simple, we're going to grab that same sort of like, you know, dark material here. And what we're going to do is we're going to add some scratches, and this is the material that's going to show through for our scratches. And it's nothing special. It's just literally this dark material here, because they're going to be so small. It doesn't need to be anything special. I don't need to create like the most detailed material underneath, because it's going to be tiny. So I don't need to like worry about spending all that time on there doing that. Now let's find some scratches. So there's a cool thing called puck scratches, which is loads of like different scratches all over a different texture map here. And let me pull that in there. And we're going to use this as our second layer mask, right? So we've got our first layer mask, which is these dirt drips, and this is going to be our second one, and this is going to work between this and our base color now. So if we plug that in, so I'm sort of running out of space, so that could be our layer color 2, and then this is going to be our blend mask 2 to blend between our base and our second color. So let's plug this into blend color 2. And again, we can see that we need to use our lovely little ramp node to invert these again. So let me plug that into our input, plug that into there, and we're going to just really quickly invert that. And then what I might do is I'm not too keen on how it's looking. I think first of all, I think it's way too big. So let me just come into my scale of my scratches, and I'm going to go like 3 by 3. And basically it's just going to sort of like multiply these so we get nice smaller scratches, maybe even, you know, 4 by 4. And what I'm noticing is it's way too sort of like, it's way too heavy. We're seeing way too many scratches. And so the way that I can fix that inside of my ramp, I can now just sort of pull this black knot over, this black handle, and now it's hiding a lot more of those. So we can sort of even do that a bit more. So it's not, we want them to be sort of like, just like nice and like faint. So let me come back into here. So this is now what we've created. We've created this really nice looking tiled texture. And if we come out of here, we can see exactly what we've made. So let me just sort of reorganize this a little bit. So we have our base material, which is, you know, our tiles, and it goes into this sort of like yellowy diffuse color here, and that's our base color. And then we used our slightly darker yellow material as our layer color 1, and we use this these sort of like drip dirt texture map setup, 1 to control our blend color between these two, so like our blending mask. We then used it to add some bump detail onto here, onto our second material, and we even used it to control our reflection roughness on our base material. And then we just added this little like this sort of like dark grey texture as our layer color 2, and then we used our puck scratches as our blend color 1, as our blend color 2 between the two of them. And now, last but by no means least, let's just add a bit of displacement on here, and this is going to help just to, you know, add some more realistic shadows and more realistic reflections. So we know we need to grab ourselves a displacement node, and then we plug that into our displacement. And then we want to add our Redshift tags by right-clicking, going to Redshift tags and Redshift object, and then we override our geometry and override our displacement. And this might be a little bit too heavy, so we can go to 0.5. And what I didn't do, so remember at the very beginning, when I adjusted my tiles, I adjusted my scale. I need to make sure that I adjust my same scale because it's the same sort of base texture map. So I just need to come in there and go 0.5, and then it should fix that. And that's what we have created, this really nice sort of tiled texture in the background. And I quite like it. I think it looks, I think it's quite nice. And, you know, it's kind of, it accumulates the stuff that we've been looking at. We're looking at texture maps, and then also with dirt maps as well. Okay, so I'm very aware it's 10:2. I did also want to go through this worn leather material, but I don't think we have time, and I might have a little like skip through some of the questions and see if there's any that I can like really quickly answer. But for the sakes of this, let's just have a look at some of these other materials on here. So as I kick this off, you'll notice that we've pretty much matched these materials. You know, we literally have just made this one, we made these planks, and we made this scratched metal surface as well. So let's just have a look at some of the others. So this worn leather was like a really interesting looking material, and you might look at this and think, oh my god, this looks like crazy, there's a lot going on, but there really isn't. And this is all of the stuff that we have just looked at. So let's break this down now together so you guys can understand how this was put together. But believe me, it's literally the just the stuff that we just did now. So how was this done? So these 3 texture maps here, these are our 4K leather texture maps. If we go into our Finder, we can see that we have our 4K leather texture maps, right? These are here. So those were drag and dropped into our shader graph. And then they're all plugged into TriPlanars. And that's because we needed to fix their projection when being put on top of our like our, you know, they're like our leather cushions, or like the sofa booth thing. That's what this is on. And then each of those is then plugged into this base Redshift material. So we have our diffuse color, our reflection roughness, and our bump input. The biggest difference here is between our diffuse color and our TriPlanar, we have something called a color correct node. And this can be used to basically color correct our diffuse texture map. And so you guys are probably used to all of these settings inside of here. If you've been working inside of After Effects or you work inside of Photoshop, you know what these different tools mean. And so all we have to do is we grab ourselves a color correct node, pull that in, and then we can adjust these settings, and it's going to adjust and it's going to change our diffuse color. And so that's a way of doing some simple color correction inside of Redshift without having to worry about, you know, adding this into like downloading it, putting it into like Photoshop, doing your color correction. We can do it directly inside of here. Okay, cool. So what do we have next? So the main thing that we didn't have time to go through is actually this bump blender. But let's just take a look at it now, because let's see, like, let's break it down. So we have our normal map, right? Going into our TriPlanar, going into our bump, and this goes into our bump blender. It doesn't go directly into our bump input. And then we have a second bump setup here, which uses a dirt map into a bump map into our bump blender as well. And then so we have a base input, and we have a sorry, we have a bump input of 0. And then we have a blend weight. And basically what it's doing is it's taking these 2 bump setups and it's combining them and blending them based on this weight value. So if I had a weight value of 0, we're going to get 100% of this bump, right? If I have a blend value of 1, we're going to have 100% this bump. But because I have a blend value of 0.5, and then it goes into my bump input, we have a nice combination of these 2 bumps. And you can do the exact same thing with displacement. So we can do the exact same thing with displacement as well. You'll notice we have similar sort of settings. Right, what do we have next? We then have a second material. And what you notice on my second material is half the time I just use plain colors. But by all means, you could use texture maps and set this up as your second material as well. It depends on the look that you're after, depends on your photorealism and how much detail is actually shining through, actually coming through based on your blending mask. So this was our second layer. And then we're using that same, you know, that same dirt texture. I told you I like it. I told you it's my favorite one. We're using that same dirt material, which is working as our blending mask or our blend color 2. And it's also being the bump, again, very similar to how we created those dirty tiles. It goes into the bump of the second material. And then last but not least, we have our displacement set up. And then you'll remember from the very first material we created, we used a constant to control certain settings of our textures. And in our case, we have it controlling our scale inside of here as well. So that's how, so this was probably the most advanced-ish material. I mean, as was the grungy tiles, but I'm sorry we didn't manage to actually get around to kind of building this one from scratch, but hopefully with the information that we've just gone through, and hopefully me breaking it down now like that, will help you guys to kind of like see how it was made and see how you can like tweak these yourselves. Like feel free to go into the color correct or any of these inputs, and you can mess with all of this stuff. Like you are absolutely more than welcome to use these textures and stuff. Like you can use them, you can tweak them, you can mess with them, or build some of your own. Like it'll be really interesting to see how people start to create some of this stuff inside of there. So I did want to get to converting textures. Oh, I thought that would be a good. Let's really quickly show how to convert textures, because I know that was a question that came up a little bit. So forgive me, I'm going to do this super fast. I'm just going to set my renderer to Redshift. Don't worry about following along. This is just so I can show you guys how things work, how the conversion process works. Right, Redshift render view. Sweet, so we have that set up. Cool. So converting textures inside of Redshift, right? So let's say we have a standard material. So we have this nice asphalt material here, right? So this is a C4D material. If we double click it, we can see it's made in the material editor. And what's really great is this material was created in a physical way. And so some people, if you don't know what that means, so basically inside of C4D's material editor, we can create standard materials using the color channel, or we can create what are called PBR materials, which are more physical and therefore more accurate, and they are built entirely inside of the reflectance channel. The big downside to this is when converting these PBR materials to Redshift is unable to see the individual layers inside of the reflectance channel. And so what I mean by that is, if I have my material here, I'm going to come over to, I've got it selected, I'm going to come over to Redshift, Materials, Tools, Convert Materials. Right, and so we can already see that it's like this black circle. And I'm going to open this up and we can just sort of have a look at how this works. And so what you guys can probably see is we've got like our C4D shader, which has our bump in it. It then goes into our texture node, which we need to because it's a C4D shader, and then our bump map. However, the rest of it has not been able to work. So we have a diffuse color of black, hence the black here, and we have some reflection based on a Maxon noise, and it's plugged into our reflection color. So unfortunately, when it comes to converting PBR materials like that, it doesn't really work properly. Well, it doesn't work at all. Like we can see here, it just hasn't worked. However, if we let's grab what one would do it, maybe brick. If we grab this material, which I believe is created using in a different way. Okay, cool. Yep. So we have our color. So we have our color texture here. We've got some diffusion. We then have a reflection, and we then have a bump map. Because this is in the individual channels, this should work a lot better. So we go Redshift, Materials, Tools, Convert Materials. As you can see, already because of our material preview, we're having a much more accurate result. So we have our diffuse texture, which is plugged into our diffuse color. We then have our bump texture plugged into our bump map inside of here. And so it's done, and it's tried to like work out the reflections based on the reflections inside of the standard material editor. So it's kind of, you know, it's done a better job basically than our PBR materials. So I guess my personal opinion is I would build my materials just inside of Redshift again. Like I know it could be a bit annoying, but I think if you want to get the best out of these textures and these materials, then building them from scratch again and just making sure that they are as good as they can be is just going to make your work nicer, and it's going to make it just look a whole load better. And believe me, like, I know how frustrating that can be. Like, I've done the same. I had a native kit bash kit and I had to convert it all to Redshift, but it is in the long run worthwhile, and now I have access to all of those Redshift textures that I know I don't really need to worry about adjusting, apart from, like, you know, scale, rotation, offset, and height scale, because I've done that. But that is the process if you do want to try it and give it a go, and even use it as like a starting point and then build up your reflections and stuff from scratch. But yeah, remember, it's not able to see the different layers in the inside of the reflectance channel for that. Okay, cool. So I'm just having a little look at some of the questions. So how long before it's on YouTube? It will probably be, for me, it's now the evening, so it's going to be tomorrow morning. So someone's saying how to export an object. So we will look at baking, but probably not in this session. Maybe it's something we'll look at when it's doing the demystifying post-production. So just so everyone knows, like, I think I said it at the beginning, but in March we're going to be running a slightly more advanced Redshift demystifying post-production series where we look at a bunch of different things.
Hey Elly, quick question. A couple people were saying that they couldn't access the Q&A in the Dropbox, and so I don't know if, like, if there's permissions there or whatever. But
okay, there shouldn't be, because it should be in the same project file link. Let me just link this now. Inside of here. So, oh, Chad, could you do me a favor? Could you see if you could access it, just to kind of double check?
I can access it. Yeah, I'm seeing it.
You've got it, yeah?
Yes.
Okay, let me.
I wonder if I could copy the link address. I'm going to try to copy the actual PDF and put the link in the chat.
Yeah, so, cool. That would be really cool. So let me. So let me really quickly. So yeah, like, guys, there are so many, like, great questions in here. Like, what I'm gonna do, so at the very beginning, in case anyone, like, wasn't here, we talked about how you guys asked so many great questions in that first part of this session that I definitely, like, it's impossible to, like, get to them all as much as I would love to. And so instead, I have kind of accumulated them all and written down some answers to them, and I'm making, like, a Q&A doc on the Dropbox link, so the one that you guys can have, and you should be able to, like, go on there, and I've got week 1 on there so far, and then what I'll do, I'll go through all of these other ones, and all the ones that I didn't answer or didn't get answered over this session, I will just add to this. Maybe I'll make it like a second document, or maybe I'll just add it to this one, because, you know, you guys ask so many great questions. I think it's, like, it's going to be such a important tool to have, this Q&A.
Hey Elly, Simon here.
So generous of you.
At the end. So, sorry to surprise you.
Hey, what's up, Simon?
I've just added that. Oh, hiya. I just added that PDF into the handout section of the GoToWebinar control panel, which is how we could do both. We could apply that to the Dropbox link as normal. But if you all were looking at your handout section, in the webinar software interface, it says handouts, and then in there's a Redshift section. I should turn my camera and say hi, shouldn't I?
Yeah, I thought I'd turn my camera back on because we're kind of at the end anyway.
Please.
You can say hello to everybody. You got your hat.
Yeah, welcome, Simon. Welcome.
I couldn't miss Elly's birthday.
Oh, don't worry. We said it at the beginning because I am shameless and just wanted the happy birthdays. But everyone did, and it was so sweet. Yeah, cool. So let me wrap up. So once again, everyone, thank you so much for, you know, being part of this session. Like, you know how much I enjoy these sessions, and to Chad for being here, and then to Simon. But Chad, I appreciate all the questions that you ask as well. I know absolutely, like, there are so many, which is why we're doing this Q&A thing now as well. But yeah, it's been so lovely to have you all on, and thanks to everyone. I know we're overrunning. that's still here. And for anyone who is still here, let me give them a little presentation back up. You know how I love to do this little presentation. So next week, oh look, I've even done a mistake here. Part 2 node materials. Ignore that. It's not. It's part 3. Oh no, part 3. Oh. I'll edit this out. Look, camera, post effects. Here's what I made earlier. Right, cool. So next week, part 3, lights, camera, post effects. We're going to be diving into Redshift lights inside of Cinema 4D and Redshift. And we're going to look at dome lights, HDRIs, which we already kind of touched on in part 1. But we're then going to be diving even further into, you know, area lights, the sun and sky rig. So, you know, on today's project file, we had those like that nice sunshine shining through. That uses the sun and sky rig, and it's super powerful and it's super cool to use. Then we're going to look at volumetric lighting, and then we're going to dive into looking at, you know, like standard camera, that RS camera tag that we kind of saw today but didn't actually look at. And then post effects, so creating some really cool like glow, some like bokeh, some depth of field stuff. And once again, project file is on that Dropbox link, and you know, you guys can download it and you can access that as much as you want, and just you know, break the stuff down, take the materials, take the assets, whatever you guys want. It's going to be really cool to see what you guys make over these 4 weeks with this stuff. And as always, it's been a pleasure. And I'll see you all next week. And thanks again, Chad. And thanks again for all of your questions, everyone, you know, and for the lovely birthday messages and the get well soon. Hopefully I didn't cough too much on camera.
It's like one of the best Maxon training things like that we've ever done in the history of Maxon, probably. I'm just going to go out on a limb and say that.
Is that why you're wearing the party hat, really? Is it for the workshop? I feel like now we just have to like continue to wear party hats because we're just super like pumped to be here.
Yeah, it's gonna feel like a funeral next week. We don't.
Or maybe we can pretend it's someone's birthday. If it's someone's birthday next week, let us know and we can like celebrate it. Like, we don't mind.
Birthday month. You can celebrate all
birthday month. Yes.
There you go.
I feel like can I have that? Can I claim birthday month? But I'm sticking to my age though. I don't want to get any older each time, if that's okay. All right, sweet. So we will wrap this up. And yes, this will either be on YouTube channel later today. Absolute latest, it will be tomorrow morning for you guys to catch up. We'll timestamp it, make sure all the links are on there so you guys can access that. And as soon as I can, I will go through all the questions and I'll answer those as well and put that on that doc for you guys.
Whew.
So, right, I'm off now. I hope everyone has a great rest of their week, and we'll see you next week for part 3.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Elly.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks, Chad.
Thank you.